I have led tour across the forecourt of Thornwick Palace for 11 years, and I have learned to read a crowd the way a sailor reads weather. So when the woman in the cream coat shoved to the front of my group and demanded to know why she could not simply walk through the King's Gate for a private viewing, I felt the air change before she ever raised her voice. I knew, the way you know a storm is coming, that someone was about to test the one man on that whole vast square who was not allowed to react. What I did not know was that within the hour she would throw something at him hard enough to leave the palace, and her holiday in ruins. Her name does not matter, and out of plain decency I will not use it. I will call her the lady in the cream coat, because that is what my group called her afterward, in the low, embarrassed voices people use when they have watched a stranger humiliate herself and cannot quite believe it happened in front of them. She had paid for the standard 9 o'clock walking tour, the same as the 11 other people gathered around me at the bronze bollards. She had not paid for a private tour because we do not offer one. There is no private tour. There has never been a private tour. I had said this to her twice already at the meeting point, and twice she had smiled at me the way you smile at a waiter who has brought the wrong dish, as though my answer were a clerical error she would soon have corrected. I think you'll find, she said, that there's always a way for the right sort of person. I have heard that sentence, or one very like it, more times than I can count. It is the password of a certain kind of traveler, the one who believes the velvet rope is for other people, that every closed door has a button somewhere marked yes if you only know whom to ask. I gave her my practiced, pleasant smile, the one that has carried me through 11 years of difficult mornings, and I told her the truth, that the guard at the King's Gate stands a working sentry post, that he is not a doorman, not an attraction, not a member of staff I could summon, and that no amount of asking would move him or open that gate. She looked at the guard then for the first time. We all did. He stood under the stone arch of the King's Gate in the red wool tunic, the tall black bearskin, the white gloves, the polished metals catching the thin September sun, his rifle at his shoulder and his eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance that none of us could see. He was utterly still. He was so still that 2 children in my group had already asked me in delighted whispers whether he was a real man or a very good statue. He was a real man. I would learn his name only later, when it mattered, Sergeant Harlan Voss, though I did not know it standing there. But in that moment, he was simply the figure every visitor to Thornwick photographs, and almost no visitor truly sees. A man holding himself to a standard the rest of us could not hold for 10 minutes. The lady in the cream coat saw something else. She saw an obstacle, and she had spent, I suspect, a great deal of her life teaching obstacles to move. Well, she said, brightening, as if she had solved a riddle, I'll just ask him myself. I told her she could not. I told her, as gently and as firmly as I could, that the guard would not speak, could not break his post, and that approaching him beyond the marked line was not permitted. I pointed to the brass studs set into the cobblestones, the line every tour guide in the city points to 100 times a season, the line that says this far and no farther. I have a small speech I give about that line. I did not get to finish it. She was already walking toward him. I want to be fair to her, even now. She was not in those first moments cruel. She was something I find harder to forgive than cruelty, because cruelty at least knows what it is doing. She was certain. She walked up to the brass line with the bright, brisk confidence of a woman who has never once been told no and meant it, and she stopped a foot from the guard's boots, tilted her head, and addressed him as though he were a concierge at a hotel that had recently disappointed her. "Hello," she said. "I'd like a private viewing of the state rooms, just the state rooms, 20 minutes. I've come an awfully long way and I'm not the sort to make trouble." She paused, waiting for him to respond, to nod, to do anything. He did nothing. His eyes did not so much as flicker to her. "I'll make it worth everyone's while," she added, in a lower voice, the kind of voice that in her world had always finished the sentence for her. I have watched a great many people approach that gate over 11 years, and I have watched a great many of them try, in their various ways, to make a man of stone into a man who serves them. Most of them give up in seconds. They laugh, a little nervously, take their photograph and rejoin the group. The brave ones lean in close to see if he will blink, and when he does not, the silence of him defeats them and they retreat. It is, in its quiet way, one of the small daily lessons of this square, that there exists in the world a discipline that money and charm and certainty cannot touch, and that watching it can be strangely calming, like watching a tide that will not be hurried. The lady in the cream coat was not calmed, she was insulted. "I'm speaking to you," she said. Sergeant Voss looked through her at the middle distance, as he was trained to do, as he was sworn to do, as he had no doubt done 10,000 times before for 10,000 people who imagined themselves the exception. The thin sun caught the brass of his buttons. A pigeon crossed the forecourt. Somewhere behind me, one of the children laughed, and the lady's head snapped around toward the sound as though the laughter had been aimed at her, which it had not. That, I think, was the moment it turned. Until then she had been an ordinary nuisance, the kind I manage every week. But a person who feels watched and feels foolish is a far more dangerous thing than a person who is merely arrogant, and I saw the color come up in her face, and I started moving toward her even before I knew what I meant to do. "Madam," I called, keeping my voice level, "please step back to the group. The sergeant can't help you. No one can. There's no private tour for anyone, I promise you, not for me, not for the visitors who come every day, not for anybody. It's the same answer for everyone, and that's rather the point of it." She did not look at me. She had locked onto the guard now with the fixed, glittering attention of someone determined to win a contest the other party did not know they were in. "Everyone keeps saying that," she said to him, not to me. "Everyone keeps hiding behind everyone. Well, you're a person, aren't you? You have a mouth. Use it. Say no to my face like a man instead of standing there pretending you can't hear me." He could hear her. I have spoken with guardsmen since, and they will tell you they hear everything, every taunt, every plea, every child's question, every cruel word, and that the hearing is the hard part, that the stillness is not the absence of feeling but the mastery of it. He heard her. He simply did not give her the reaction she had come to collect, and the not giving was, to a woman like that, the worst insult of all. She fumbled in the canvas tote bag on her shoulder, and for one cold second I did not know what she was reaching for, and neither, I would later learn, did the two men I had not yet noticed standing very still and very attentive near the gatehouse wall. She came out with a small object and held it up between them, and I saw it was a souvenir. One of the heavy little snow globes they sell in the shops along the approach, the kind with a miniature palace inside and a screw of glitter that settles like snow, the kind that weighs more than you expect because the base is solid resin and the dome is real glass. She had bought it, I suppose, an hour earlier as a memento of a lovely day. "Look at me," she said, and her voice cracked on the second word, and that crack frightened me more than a shout would have. "Look at me, or I swear." I was perhaps 15 feet away. I could not have reached her in time. I would replay that distance for weeks afterward. The 15 feet I could not close, but the truth is that nothing I could have done would have changed what came next, because the only person on that forecourt with the power to change, it was the one person who had decided, long before this morning, that he would not. She threw the snow globe at him. I have tried many times to describe what that throw was like, and I have never quite managed it. It was not a wild, flailing thing. That is the part I keep returning to. It was a deliberate, overhand throw, the kind you would use to hurt someone, and she put her shoulder into it from 6 feet away, and the heavy little globe left her hand and crossed the gap between them faster than I would have believed and struck Sergeant Voss square on the cheekbone, just below the chinstrap of his bearskin. I heard it. That is the detail my group remembered most afterward, when the police took their statements one by one against the gatehouse wall, not the sight of it but the sound, a hard flat crack that carried clear across the forecourt, and bounced off the stone arch and made every single one of us flinch. Every single one of us except the man it was aimed at. He did not flinch. He did not raise a hand. He did not stagger, though I have since learned from the medical report, read aloud later, in a room with very different acoustics, that the blow opened a cut along his cheekbone, and that a lesser man, or any normal man, would have gone down or at least staggered back a full pace from the force of it. The glass dome shattered against the resin base on the cobblestones at his feet, and the screw of glitter spilled out across the worn stone like a handful of cheap snow, and a thin line of red welled along his cheek and ran down toward his jaw, and Sergeant Harlan Voss stood exactly as he had stood the moment before, his eyes fixed on the middle distance, his rifle at his shoulder, his breathing, I was close enough now to see this, perfectly, impossibly even. For 1 full second nobody on that forecourt moved or spoke. I have stood in that square in every kind of weather and every kind of crowd, and I have never heard it as silent as it was in that second. Even the lady in the cream coat seemed shocked by what her own hand had done. The brightness had gone out of her face. She stood with her arms still half raised, staring at the red line on the guard's cheek as though it had appeared there by some trick that had nothing to do with her. Then the second ended, and 3 things happened almost at once. The first was that the 2 men I had half noticed by the gatehouse wall, the still, attentive ones, stopped being still. They were not tourists. I understood that in the instant they moved, the way you understand a shape in the dark the moment it steps into light. They were palace police, plainclothes, the men whose entire job is to stand unremarkably at the edges of the forecourt and watch for exactly the thing that had just happened. And they crossed the cobbles toward the lady in the cream coat with a calm, unhurried speed that was somehow more alarming than any sprint. The second was that a second uniformed guardsman appeared from the shadow of the gatehouse arch. I had not even known he was there, and took up a position a few feet from Sergeant Voss, not touching him, not speaking to him, simply standing where the relief stands, so that the post itself was never for 1 moment unmanned. The discipline of it struck me even then in the middle of everything, that even bleeding, even assaulted, the line was held, the post was covered, the thing they were guarding stayed guarded. Nothing about the gate changed because a woman had lost her temper. That, I think now, is the whole of what these men are. The gate does not change. The third thing was the lady in the cream coat, recovering herself, deciding, I watched her decide it, that the way out of this was to become the victim. He startled me, she announced, to no one and everyone, taking a step back as the 2 plainclothes men closed in. That's not, I didn't mean. He was being deliberately provocative, you all saw it, he wouldn't answer me. He was mocking me, the way he just stood there. Madam, said the taller of the 2 men, in the flat courteous tone of a person who has heard every version of this speech, I need you to stop talking now and come with me. Do you know who I am? I winced. 11 years on this forecourt, and I can tell you that no sentence in the language has ever improved a person's situation, and yet they reach for it every time, the way a drowning man reaches for whatever is nearest, even when the nearest thing is a stone. No, madam, the man said, taking her gently but unmistakably by the upper arm, and right now it doesn't much matter. You've just thrown a glass object at a member of the KingsGuard on his post and caused him an injury in front of a dozen witnesses, and that's an assault. You can explain who you are at the station. It was the word assault, I think, that finally reached her, because the bright certainty that had carried her up to that brass line collapsed all at once, and underneath it was something small and frightened and entirely ordinary. She began to cry. She said she hadn't meant it. She said it was just a souvenir, just a little globe. She hadn't thought it would, she hadn't realized, and I believed her in a way. I believed she had not, in the heat of it, performed the small calculation that would have told her a half-pound of glass and resin thrown at a man's face is a weapon, regardless of what it was sold as in the gift shop. People like her do not perform that calculation, because the world has trained them out of the habit of imagining consequences. The consequence had always belonged to someone else. Through all of it, Sergeant Voss did not move. That is the thing I have never been able to make people understand when I tell this story, and I have told it more often than I would like, because for a few strange weeks it followed me everywhere. People hear it and they say, the way people do, why didn't he do anything? Why didn't he defend himself? He had a rifle, for heaven's sake. And I understand why they ask. We are taught, all of us, that a real man hits back, that to stand and take a blow is weakness, that the strong response to being struck is to strike. We have it backward. I did not know I had it backward until I stood on that forecourt and watched a man bleed without moving and felt, this is the only word for it, awe. Because here is what it cost him. I was close enough to see. Behind the still face there was a man, and the man was in pain, and the man's whole body wanted to do what every body wants to do when it is struck. To recoil, to raise a hand, to make the thing that hurt it stop. I could see the cost of holding still in the cords of his neck, in the white of his glove where it gripped the rifle a fraction tighter than before, in the single muscle that jumped once along his jaw and then went still. He was not a statue. A statue feels nothing, and so its stillness is nothing. He felt everything, and he held himself motionless anyway, and that, the holding, the choosing, 10,000 times a day and once, terribly, this morning, is not the absence of strength. It is the most strength I have ever seen one person spend on a single moment. He held the post because the post was not his to abandon, not for pain, not for insult, not for blood. He let the men whose job it was deal with the woman whose offense it was. He did not make himself the story. And in doing exactly nothing, he made the lady in the cream coat's failure complete, because the entire foundation of her mourning had been the belief that she could make him react, and she had thrown the heaviest thing she had at the very center of that belief, and it had not so much as turned his head. They led her away across the forecourt. She was still talking about her solicitor, about a complaint, about how she would be writing to someone, always someone, the eternal someone to whom the people of her sort appeal. But the talking had gone thin and frightened, and no one was listening, least of all the man in the gatehouse who was now murmuring into a radio, and least of all the dozen of us who had paid for a walking tour and received instead an education. My group did not disperse. That surprised me. Tourists, in my experience, scatter from trouble like starlings. They do not want their holiday to contain a police matter. But this group stayed, gathered close, quiet, and I understood that they had seen something they did not want to walk away from before they had finished understanding it. One of the children, the one who had laughed, the one whose laughter had set the whole thing alight without meaning to, was crying now silently, and his mother had her hand over her mouth, and a young man near the back had stopped filming on his phone partway through, which I think says more than anything about the difference between a thing worth watching and a thing worth witnessing. "Is he all right?" the boy's mother asked me very softly. "The guard, is he going to be all right?" I did not know. I am a tour guide. I am not a doctor and I am not a soldier, and I had never in 11 years seen a man struck on his post. But I looked at Sergeant Voss, at the thin line of red on his cheek now reaching his jaw, at the absolute steadiness of him, and I found I believed the answer even before I said it. "Yes," I told her, "I think he'll be all right. I don't think there's much in this world that man can't stand." I want to tell you that the relief came then, that someone trotted out, that they stood him down and tended to him, and the morning resolved into the kind of tidy ending a story is supposed to have. It did not happen that quickly. This is the part that the people who ask, "Why didn't he hit back?" never think about. He stood there bleeding, for what I am told was another 6 minutes. I did not time it. I am going by the police log, read out later, because the relief had to be properly mounted, the post properly handed over, the change of guard done by the book even in the middle of an incident, because the one thing these men will not do, the thing they would sooner bleed than do, is improvise the discipline that is the whole of their honor. The rules do not bend because a rule breaker has hurt you. If anything, they hold harder. I have thought about that a great deal since. When the relief came, it came as a small formal ceremony in the middle of a forecourt full of police tape and spilled glitter. 3 guardsmen marching in step. A quiet exchange of words I could not hear. The rifle shifted from one shoulder to another. The boots brought together with a single hard report on the stone. And only then, only when another man stood the post in his place, only when the gate was once again held by someone whose duty it now was, did Sergeant Harlan Voss turn from the King's Gate and march, straight-backed and even-paced, blood drying on his face, toward the gatehouse and the medic and the men who would take his statement. He did not look at the spot where the lady in the cream coat had stood. He did not look at us. He looked at where he was going, and he went there, and a small ragged sound went up from my group that I realized, a beat too late, was applause, uncertain, almost ashamed of itself, the way decent people applaud when they are not sure it is allowed but cannot help themselves. He gave no sign that he heard it. But the second guardsman, the relief, the young one who now held the gate, allowed himself the smallest motion as Voss passed, a half-inch lift of the chin, a soldier's nod, there and gone. And I understood that I had just watched one disciplined man tell another that he had done it right, in the only language the post permits. That should have been the end of it. For most stories of this kind, that is the end of it. The wrong is done, the consequence begins. The disciplined man walks away with his honor intact, and the rest is paperwork. But I have learned that the true measure of a thing like this is not the moment itself. It is what comes after who shows up, what they decide, and whether the world arranges itself in the days that follow to agree with the certain woman or with the still man. I stayed because something in me needed to know how it ended, and because the police wanted my statement, and because, I will admit, I had become a small part of the thing without intending to, the way you do. Before any of that, though, there was the rest of that morning to get through, and it changed my group in a way I have never seen a tour change a group before or since. We did not finish the route. There was no finishing it. The heart had gone out of the itinerary, and the forecourt was half cordoned off, and no one wanted to hear me recite the dates of arches after what they had just watched. So we stood in a loose knot near the bronze bollards and waited to give our statements, and a strange thing happened. A group of strangers who had begun the morning as 11 separate parties of holidaymakers became, for an hour, something closer to a company of witnesses. They talked to each other. They checked on the boy who had laughed and then cried, and he was all right, and his mother thanked me 3 times for nothing in particular, the way people do when they are grateful to be standing near someone who seems to know what is happening. An older gentleman from the back of the group, who had said almost nothing all morning, came up to me and said quietly that he had served once himself, a long time ago, in a different uniform, and that what he had just seen a man do, take a blow and hold the line and let the order of things do the rest, was the hardest thing a soldier is ever asked to do, and the thing the films never get right. I have thought about that too. The films always have the disciplined man finally snap, finally hit back, and they call it catharsis. The old gentleman knew better. The catharsis, he told me, is in the not snapping. The catharsis is the line that holds. The young man who had stopped filming came and found me as well before the police took him aside, and he showed me the few seconds he had caught before he put the phone down. I watched it once. I have not watched it since, and I asked him when the police were done not to put it anywhere, and to his great credit he never did. It was not ours to make a spectacle of. The man had bled in public. He did not need to bleed online forever. But I will tell you what was on those few seconds because it matters. The throw, the crack, and then a single frame of the guard's face the instant after the globe struck it. And even there, even frozen, even with the red just beginning, his eyes were already back on the middle distance. He had taken the blow and returned to his post in the time it takes a phone to catch one frame. He had never really left it at all. What came after was not loud. That is what I want you to understand. It was not a convoy or a courtroom drama or a great public reckoning. It was a series of quiet, ordinary doors closing, one after another, in the face of a woman who had spent her whole life certain that doors opened. The first door closed in the gatehouse, where I gave my statement to a patient inspector named Halloran, who had the manner of a man who had spent 30 years collecting the small lies people tell to make themselves the hero of their own bad behavior. He did not lead me. He asked me to describe, in my own words, what I had seen, and I described it, and when I had finished he asked me a single question that I have never forgotten. "In your professional judgment," he said, "having watched a great many people approach that gate, was she provoked?" I thought about it honestly because I owed it to everyone in that room to be honest, including her. "No," I said, "she wasn't provoked. She was refused. There's a difference, and the difference is the whole of it. He never did one thing to her. He didn't even look at her. That was what she couldn't bear, not that he was rude, but that he wasn't anything at all, that she couldn't reach him. She threw it because she'd run out of ways to make a man who wouldn't move into a man who would." Halloran wrote that down, all of it, and I learned later that the 11 other statements from my group said, in their 11 different ways, exactly the same thing. There was no version of the morning in which Sergeant Voss had done anything but stand at his post. There was no provocation to find. A dozen ordinary people, none of whom knew each other, none of whom had any reason to lie, had all watched the same thing, and the thing they had watched was a woman assault a man who had given her nothing but his silence. The second door closed that afternoon, and it was the one I did not see coming, the one that turned this from a thing that happened to a stranger into a thing that happened to me, a little as well. Because the lady in the cream coat had not arranged her own holiday. She had booked it, the flights, the hotel, the city tour, the whole gilded package, through a travel company. A good one, the kind that prides itself on smoothing the path for exactly the sort of traveler who believes the path should be smoothed. And that company, as it happened, was the same company whose walking tour I had led across the Thornwick forecourt for 11 years. Her tour and mine were the same tour. I had not known it that morning. She was a name on a list, a face in a group. But that afternoon, when the company's regional manager telephoned me, not to reprimand me, as I first feared, but to ask me, carefully, what I had seen, I understood that the woman who had thrown a glass globe at a KingsGuard had done it, in a sense, on my company's time, wearing my company's lanyard around her neck. I told the regional manager exactly what I had told Inspector Halloran. I did not soften it. I did not have it in me to soften it. I had watched a man bleed without moving, and the sight had burned the softness out of me for the day. And the regional manager was quiet for a moment, and then he said something I have come to respect him for, though I did not expect it from a man whose entire job is to keep customers happy. "We can't have it," he said. "We trade on this city's goodwill. We bring people here on the understanding that they'll behave like guests. A guest doesn't assault the household. I don't care how much she paid." I learned over the following days that they did, in fact, care how much she paid, that she had paid a great deal, that she was the kind of repeat client a company is loath to lose, that there were meetings, that lawyers were consulted, that the easy thing, the profitable thing, would have been to issue a careful apology and quietly absorb it and hope it blew over. But the company did not do the easy thing. They issued her a formal notice that her account was closed, and that she would not be welcome on any of their tour, in that city or any other, again. They refunded the unused portion of her holiday and asked her, in writing, not to use their services in future. They banned her. A travel company banned a paying customer not for being difficult, not for complaining, not for any of the ordinary frictions of the trade, but because she had thrown a souvenir at a man who would not turn his head, and they had decided, a corporation, a thing with no honor of its own, that some lines are worth more than a customer. I do not think they decided it on their own. I think a dozen statements decided it for them, and a city's goodwill, and perhaps some private knowledge of what it would mean to be the company that shrugged at an assault on the KingsGuard. But I have noticed in the years since that institutions tend to find their courage when ordinary people have already shown theirs. And that morning, a dozen ordinary people had stood on a forecourt and refused, every one of them, to pretend they had seen anything other than what they saw. The company's courage was second-hand. It was no less real for that. The third door I learned about only because Inspector Halloran, who turned out to be a decent and unexpectedly talkative man, told me a piece of it over a cup of tea some weeks later, when he asked me to confirm my statement before the matter went forward. He should not have told me, I suspect, and I will not repeat the parts that were his to keep. But he told me this much, that the lady in the cream coat had, in the days after, done exactly what I would have predicted. She had threatened to sue. She had produced a solicitor. She had argued that the guard's silence was itself a kind of aggression, that she had felt menaced by his refusal to engage, that a reasonable person would have been frightened by a large armed man ignoring her, and that the throw had been a panicked reaction to a threatening situation. It was, Halloran said, a clever argument, and it failed completely, and it failed for a reason that has stayed with me. It failed because of who Sergeant Harlan Voss turned out to be. He was not, I should say plainly, a secret hero with a hidden past, the way these stories sometimes go. He was something quieter and, to my mind, more convincing. He was a man with 18 years of unbroken service and not one mark against him, not one complaint, not one lapse, not one morning in 18 years on which he had given anyone the faintest cause to call him anything but exactly what he was. The argument that he had menaced her required a jury to believe that a man who had stood that gate for the better part of 2 decades, photographed by 500,000 strangers, had on this one morning chosen to threaten a tourist by standing perfectly still and saying nothing. It required them to believe that his stillness was a weapon and her glass globe was self-defense. And the trouble with that argument, Halloran said, was that there were a dozen witnesses to the stillness and a hard, flat crack of evidence to the globe, and not a single human being on that forecourt. Not the children, not the man who stopped filming, not the tour guide of 11 years, had felt menaced by the guard. They had felt the opposite. They had felt that the only calm, safe, trustworthy thing in that whole frightening minute was the man who would not move. You cannot menace a crowd into feeling protected. The defense collapsed under the weight of its own absurdity. There was, Halloran told me, one more thing, and this is the part that I think of as the true heart of it, the part that has nothing to do with courts or companies and everything to do with the man himself. When the investigators sat Sergeant Voss down to take his account, expecting the natural human thing, expecting a man who had been struck in the face to want the woman who struck him punished to the fullest, they found instead a man who answered every question in the same level, exact, unhurried voice with which he did everything, and who, when they asked him at the end whether he wished to add anything at all about the woman or the attack or what he wanted to see happen to her, was silent for a moment and then said only this: "I'd like to know if my relief got the gate squared away properly. I had to leave it a little quick." That was all. That was the whole of what he wanted. Not vengeance, not an apology, not his name in the papers. He wanted to know that the post he had been forced to leave with blood on his face had been left in good order. They told me he asked it without irony, without performance, the way another man might ask after a colleague's health, and that one of the hardened investigators in that room had to look down at his notes for a moment before he could go on. Because there it was, the whole of the difference between the two of them, laid bare in a single sentence. She had wanted the world to revolve around her injury, an injury she had manufactured. He, genuinely injured, wanted only to know that the gate was held. The matter went forward, and it did not go forward kindly for the lady in the cream coat. I was not in the room when it concluded. I am a tour guide, not a witness of any great importance, and once my statement was given, my part was largely done. But I followed it the way you follow a thing you have become quietly tangled in, and I can tell you how it ended. She pleaded, in the end, to the assault. There was no real road to anything else. You cannot throw a half-pound of glass at a man's face in front of 12 witnesses, and a clear account from a man whose word had 18 unblemished years behind it, and talk your way to innocent. She was given a sentence appropriate to a first offense by a person of previously good character who had, in a single uncharacteristic moment, done a genuinely dangerous thing, not prison, but not nothing. A conviction that would follow her, a fine that I am told stung even a woman of her means, an order to pay toward the harm she had caused, and the quiet, permanent fact, written down now in the records of the state, that she was a person who had assaulted a member of the King's Guard on his post. No solicitor could undo that. No amount of money could undo it. It was the one door that, having closed, would never open again, and it was a door she had built and shut entirely with her own hand. The travel company's ban held. I checked, in the way you check on the loose tooth of an old story. Some months later there was, I heard, an attempt, a different name, a different card, a booking made through an intermediary to slip back onto one of the tour, perhaps even onto mine, and the company's people, who keep better records than people imagine, caught it and turned it away at the point of sale, courteously and completely. She would not be coming back to Thornwick on their watch. The forecourt she had wanted so badly to own, the private viewing she had been certain she could conjure if she only refused to be told no, was now the one place in the world she could not go. And Sergeant Harlan Voss. I went back to the gate, of course. I go back every working day. It is my livelihood, and I have come to think something more than that. The cut on his cheek healed cleanly. There was, the last I saw, the faintest pale line along the cheekbone, the kind of mark you would only notice if you knew to look, and most people do not know to look. He was back on his post within the week, standing the King's Gate in the red tunic and the tall bearskin, his eyes fixed on the middle distance, his rifle at his shoulder exactly as before. Photographed by strangers, asked by delighted children whether he was a real man or a very good statue, unchanged, unbroken. As though nothing at all had happened, because in the only way that mattered to him nothing had. The gate had been held, the post had been kept, the discipline had not bent, and the wrong had been answered by people whose job it was to answer it, while he did the one thing that was his to do, which was to stand. I have led my tour past that gate hundreds of times since, and I have changed the small speech I give. I still point to the brass line in the cobblestones, the this far and no farther line, but I no longer talk only about the rules. I tell them now, the thing I learned the morning the lady in the cream coat threw a souvenir at the most disciplined man I have ever seen. I tell them that the guard at that gate is not a statue, and not an attraction, and not a man they can summon or charm or buy, and that this is not because he is cold, but because he is something most of us never manage to be for 10 minutes together. A person who has decided completely what he will and will not do, and who will pay any price to keep that line rather than let someone else move it for him. I tell them about the throw, and the crack, and the blood, and the stillness. I tell them that a man who would not turn his head defeated a woman who had never in her life been refused, and that he did it without lifting a hand, without saying a word, without surrendering 1 inch of the discipline that was his whole strength. And I tell them what happened to her afterward, the arrest, the conviction, the ban, the doors that closed one by one, not because I take any pleasure in it, but because it is the truth, and because the truth of it is the lesson. That there is a kind of power in the world that money cannot buy and arrogance cannot move and certainty cannot break, and that when it is tested, it does not need to strike back. It only needs to stand. The striking back is done, in the end, by the world, by a dozen honest witnesses, by an inspector who asks the right question, by a company that finds its spine, by a court that calls a thrown weapon a thrown weapon. The disciplined man does not have to win. He only has to hold the line and let the truth catch up to it. I think of that often now, when I am tempted to bend a little, to make the easy compromise, to move my own small lines for someone who is certain they should be moved. I think of a man on a forecourt with blood on his cheek, asking only whether the gate was squared away. And I stand a little straighter and I hold. He never asked for any of it, the statements, the story, the lesson a tour guide carries around now like a stone worn smooth in a pocket. He asked for one thing on the worst morning of his 18 years, and it was not justice, and it was not sympathy, and it was not even the simple human comfort of being told he had done right. He asked whether the gate was properly held. It is. It always will be, for as long as there are men like him willing to stand it and bleed for it and ask, when it is over, after nothing but the gate. And the lady in the cream coat, who came an awfully long way to be told yes, learned the one thing she had managed to avoid learning in a whole lifetime of getting her way. That there are some doors no one will ever open for you, and that the surest way to seal them forever is to throw something at the man who is standing guard.